So one of the things that I find to be the most demystifying about this whole self-care thing is teaching the science behind what's going on inside your body when you're doing self-care. When honestly, not just when you're doing self-care, when you're doing anything that makes you feel good. Happiness, joy, contentment, feeling peaceful, not, overworked, not stressed, not depressed, right? How is it that your body looks on the inside when those good things are happening and you're feeling those good things in your life, right? I find that really demystifies and really kind of brings a different look to this idea of self-care altogether. So last week, I talked to you about how I was going to reprise this old self-care series that I did. I'm doing that again today. We'll be bringing back the second part of this series where I did do a little midlife chemistry class for you, learning about 4 neurotransmitters that are being released in our body that make us feel good, why they get released, when they get released, how they get released, and when they're not getting released, what are the symptoms that we're experiencing? What are the not so good feelings that we're experiencing? So that chemistry class is going to happen again today, and I hope you keep listening because it really gets down to the bones, the very bones of what it is that you need to be doing in your life in order to feel better and why self-care is going to get you there. So keep listening. Welcome. This is Midlife Crisis to a Centered Life Thriving, a podcast that teaches women in midlife to unapologetically stop silencing their dreams and start designing the lives they want to live in. I'm your host, Dr. Natalie, and as a clinical psychologist of the last 2 decades and a twice-divorced single mother myself, I not only know how hard it can feel heading into midlife, I am living it right here with you. I have taken all the many failed attempts and lessons learned in my own life and combine it with my extensive clinical experience to give you the tools you need to make midlife the best time in your life. No joke. So let's get started.
Are you on my mailing list yet? Because if you're not, you really should be. You want to join at learntoloveyourstory.com. If you scroll down, I'm giving away a freebie for you. Honestly, you know what it is? A free course. I sell online courses, but this is a course just for you. And it's about freeing yourself, letting go of what others' expectations and ideas are for you. You know, that nagging self-doubt in your head, it's usually fueled by your consideration of what others think of you over your consideration of what you think of you. And so I teach you in my video all about what is underlying that kind of self-doubt and how to get out of that conundrum. And I give you a workbook that goes with it that helps you to build the skill sets that you're going to need for that. So please make sure you're on my mailing list because at the least, you're going to get a free gift. And at the most, you're going to hear about all the things that we're doing on Midlife Crisis to a Centered Life Thriving and learntoloveyourstory.com. And you don't want to be missing out on any of the new things that'll be coming your way.
Welcome back, everybody. Midlife Crisis to a Centered Life Thriving. I'm so glad to be here. So glad to be reprising this self-care series. I'm not even going to monkey it up. It was a really good podcast the first time around. I'm not going to say very much to you to get started because there's no reason to educate you about what I'm about to say and then say it. I just want you to listen. But today, I want you to get your notebook out, to get your pencil out, maybe take some notes about what I'm saying. If you're driving your car, walking, great. Listen to the podcast. But when you get home, will you make some notes about the things that you learned today or go back and re-listen? You can put me on 2 speed and just whip through it really fast. But I want you to promise yourself something. I want you to make a commitment to yourself today. And that commitment is that you're going to do one thing different with your self-care. You're going to listen to what I'm teaching you here and learn what deficits with these neurochemicals looks like, why it makes you feel depressed, why it makes you feel lonely when you're not getting some of these neurochemicals in your life, and what it is that you could be doing instead to offset that. And in fact, when I originally released this, I left you with a lovely little handout, and I'm doing it again. So please go to the notes, download that handout, because it will help you. And it's also a way to remind you of the things that I'm teaching you today. But I'm kind of asking you to commit for yourself to a little bit more than you usually do with my podcast, because honestly, if you implement even one thing I'm suggesting, it could make a big difference in your life. And it certainly will change your whole outlook on what self-care is. So let's listen. I just wish that we came with a manual, like when we're born, the doctor just hands over to our parents this big book that tells you all about how we tick and why we do what we do when we do it. And that could make our lives a little bit more simpler, don't you think? I mean, especially around this idea of self-care. I mean, you heard the podcast last week. Self-care is a personal experience. And so everybody's version of the best form of self-care could look very, very different on the outside. But here's the thing. It looks the same on the inside of us. And that's the cheat sheet that this psychologist is going to give you today. This is one of my favorite things to teach, honestly, because I think that this idea of self-care has gotten, it's pretty complicated. I talked about it last week. There's, pop culture's version of it with chocolates and baths and massages and all that stuff. And then there's like this clinical side of it where we're talking about like, you need to have boundaries to keep your energy in, and we need to make sure that we're replenishing and nourishing ourselves. Oh, but by the way, that looks different for everybody. I mean, I can't just give you a cheat sheet, except I can. As a clinical psychologist, one of my favorite parts of the human psyche is that there are only 4 chemicals that are our feel-good chemicals. These are the chemicals that we monkey around with when we're talking about things like pain relief, anxiety relief, when we're talking about joy and happiness. These are all the same chemicals. And you know what? They're not just in humans. They're in all life forms. Like life forms that are one cell have receptor sites for these 4 chemicals. That means one cell organisms floating around in the ocean that you can barely see with a huge microscope also have the capacity to experience joy. What? But they do. And when you break down self-care into these 4 chemicals, well, things get a lot easier. Now, I'm going to go into this in detail in just a second here, but what I will say is I am going to put this cheat sheet together as a download that you can grab right off my website, learntoloveyourstory.com. So you can head over there, or you can head to the podcast notes, and I will have a link for you to get this cheat sheet, because I'm going to talk about all these things today, but just like with any new information that we learn, we'll forget parts of it. I might be a geek and have all this information just floating around right at the surface all the time, but I am not expecting you to. And I do want you to feel like you have a place to go to say, oh, I'm feeling like this, which means I need this chemical. And these are the things that I can do that generate this chemical. So let's get started. So these 4 chemicals are, and you may already know some of these, right? They might sound familiar, but the 4 chemicals are endorphins, dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin. 4 chemicals. Now, for those of you that are watching this on YouTube, you're going to get to see this really handy dandy handout. And these are the things that I will be sharing with everybody in my cheat sheet. But for those of you just listening, buckle up, Buttercup, because this is a lot of information all in one place. So dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, endorphins, right? I'll flip them around all over the place, but we're going to start with dopamine because I think that some of us know a little bit about this one. And dopamine is actually the chemical that helps us get motivated. It helps us enjoy things, find pleasure in things. It gives us the impetus to want to learn, right? If we're feeling kind of this inertia, like, meh, I don't want to do anything. One of the ways to really get our juices flowing is to do something creative, and dopamine is released in that creative process. So we want to look at dopamine like the chemical that creates the creation. It's the creative process piece. It is a pleasure chemical, but what's different is it's not necessarily just the end game that this chemical is looking for. And this is why I love this chemical so much. This is about the chase. And if you want to go back in one of my other podcasts, and I'll also put this in the notes, in the podcast notes for today, but if you want to go back to one of my other podcasts on relationships for powerful women, for really, overachieving women, I talked about the chase thing and I talked about the dopamine. This is one of the chemicals that actually gets in the way of having healthy relationships if what you get addicted to in your relationships is the dopamine chase and not necessarily the oxytocin, which we're going to get to a little bit later, which comes out in the relationship itself. So dopamine is this interesting chemical. It's pretty short-lived. You're only feeling it while you're doing the thing, but it's one of these chemicals that's really right at our fingertips anytime that we're creating anything, which honestly also means anytime you're like thinking of something that you want to create. It doesn't have to be the action of it. This is why I think the HGTV became so popular, because we love sitting around watching somebody remodel a house. Like, come on, can I get a amen on this? I think all of us became interior decorators because of the Property Brothers and House Hunters and all of those things, because this is such an interesting concept to watch, something go from beginning, middle to end. And it's in the process of beginning, middle, end, all the way up until end that you're having dopamine released. So this is a really great chemical for that. So since I spoke a little bit about oxytocin, let's go slip over to that. Oxytocin is the chemical that gets released in our relationship. So this is like the falling in love chemical, right? This is that feeling of euphoria that we get when we are with our people. It's that just the inside good feeling, right? It's what you get when you get a hug from somebody that you really, really love. It is a feeling that facilitates having trust in relationships. So oxytocin is around, of course, in our romantic relationships and our friendships and our family relationships, but it's also around work. So this is the chemical that really helps us to create bonds with other people, trusting bonds with other people. Well, if you work on a team, you're going to have to trust your folks. If you don't trust your folks, things at work are not going to go well. Now, I'm not an IO, industrial organization psychologist. So if you want information about that, Dr. Adam Grant or some others are a really good start. But as far as what's the inside looking like, what does my nervous system look like when I'm in relationship with other people in any context, it is oxytocin that's getting released. Okay. So again, this is a really good one because it's almost always at our fingertips. Sometimes there are some of us that are feeling pretty lonely out there, right? So I do know that it's not always readily available. And I think during the pandemic, we all really noticed a difference in our moods when we weren't having the interactions as frequently or at the level that we were prior to the pandemic. And that definitely was a shift in how much oxytocin was coming in and out of our bodies at any given time. And the relationships that we were stuck in the house with also were burdened. And so that further really made it difficult for us to get the oxytocin that we had once been used to as a nervous system. So it's an interesting, chemical in that we're wired to be with one another. We want to belong. We want to have relationships. Even if you're an introvert, you want to have some people in your life. You're just very choosy about those people and how much time that you spend with those people. But again, oxytocin doesn't get released just because you're in the relationship face to face in that moment. Oxytocin is also released in just the very notion that you feel like you belong, that you feel like you're connected. So if you're sitting here and you're reflecting on who your people are and how good that feels, and even calling up a memory of a really great experience with a friend or a family member, or even a coworker, then oxytocin is going to be involved. It's going to get released. So it is at our fingertips and we can create it. We can also, facilitate bringing it out, but really it's only being released when we're with our people, and its sole purpose really is to create those trusting bonds between us and our folks, right? So that's oxytocin. Next, serotonin. This might also be one that you've heard about. Not all of us know, but most antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications are working on this particular neurochemical and how it facilitates us and our mood. But serotonin rewards us in lots of different ways, and it comes out in lots of different ways. One thing I want you to keep in mind, though, something that's really important about serotonin in particular, is that 80% of the serotonin that we make and that we use and have receptors for in our body are located in our gut. So it's located in, the cavity where you've got all that intestine and large intestine. That's where most of this is getting generated. What's interesting to me about that is that there is a correlation in our nation between the diabetes, epidemic. I don't know if it's an epidemic, but it certainly is a huge problem. Any kind of those metabolic disorders where insulin is out of whack. Our marketing of really processed foods, and how the weight in the country has gone up. The median or middle weight has gone up over time as a result of that. That has been synonymous or correlated with more antidepressants being prescribed, more anti-anxiety medications being prescribed. Now, I'm not saying that one is causing the other. They're correlated, right? So they're happening at the same time, but it makes sense that they're happening at the same time, because if our gut is all out of whack and those internal bacteria aren't working for us, then we might not be making and or using or both that serotonin as well as we need to be. Right? So think about that, because that's a really important factor with the serotonin piece. But serotonin rewards us in particular when we feel like we know our place, we know our purpose, we know we're in alignment with what we want to do, and we can see and feel and watch ourselves be doing that thing. So there's like a social power piece to this, but power is such a strong word and not really the word that I would use necessarily, but it's how we feel in our world. If I feel like I fit in, if my puzzle pieces just goes right into this puzzle, then I feel pretty good about that. That's really one of the places where we're going to get serotonin released the most. You can also see how the lack of feeling that way. So when you're feeling listless and, don't have a direction or don't feel like you're belonging or fitting in, certainly that's going to affect our oxytocin, because it's also a relationship issue, but it also depletes our serotonin because we don't feel like we're fitting in to our place in the world, in the order of things. So that makes sense that somebody would feel depressed or anxious or both, because they're probably outside in the world trying to hustle to get there, right? So depleting in that serotonin kind of makes sense because they're not getting that pleasure from feeling like they fit. And serotonin usually can go up when we start to be able to feel that way. And then last but certainly not least, and probably the most familiar chemical of these four, is endorphins. We've all heard about endorphins. Shoot, you can get endorphins right out of a piece of dark chocolate. So endorphins are all over the place. And what they're most linked to is exercise. So any kind of physical movement is going to create release of endorphins. And endorphins are literally our body's natural anti-anxiety medication, anti-pain medication, antidepressant medication. This chemical is real potent and it hangs a little in our body. So the dopamine burns off pretty fast. Oxytocin kind of comes and goes with some, frequency. It doesn't really linger around unless you're thinking about your bonds. But endorphins actually have this capacity to be like, oh, they got dumped into my bloodstream. And so I'm going to use a little bit of that endorphin. So this is that runner's high kind of a thing. You hit that point where the endorphins dump in, and that point like lasts into your day, right? But it doesn't have to be huge amounts of exercise. It really is only movement, and movement that takes us just one step up from where our basic energy level is. So if you're somebody that's sedentary, that sits around most of the day, sits at a computer, comes home, maybe stands a little while you're making some dinner, but then sits down, watch some television while you're having your dinner, relax, talking to your people, go to bed, lay down, mostly sedentary. Okay. Don't really have an exercise regimen that you're a part of. Then raising your level would just be like walking around for 10 to 15 minutes. It doesn't, honestly, standing and making your dinner is creating endorphins for you. Certainly not at the level that, you would get if you had a runner's high, but still they're there. They're going to get released. And these definitely are at our fingertips, because anytime we decide to move our body about or even squeeze and release muscles, so you'd be sitting and clench muscles and release them, and clench muscles and release them anytime you want, right? So I want you to hear that this chemical here, it lasts and it's at our fingertips. It's probably our first choice when we just need a hit of something, when we're just feeling meh, down, something. Endorphins would be kind of what I would tell you to have in your back pocket, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So let's talk. I'm going to move my slide here. Again, if you're on YouTube with me, you get to see this. I'm sorry if you're on the podcast, you don't. But this next slide, we're going to talk about what it looks like when it's depleted. And I think this is important. Here's why. If you really want a cheat sheet on what kind of self-care I need, then it's important to understand this is what I look like when I'm depleted in dopamine. This is what I look like when I'm depleted in serotonin, and so forth. If you don't understand what your body mind is telling you, like, I'm not feeling good and here is why, then you might give it the wrong thing. And that tends to be why self-care feels like throwing spaghetti at the wall, right? Why you're like, I took the time off and I did this. Why is this not working for me? I would imagine, and if you sat down with a mental health professional that has some awareness of these chemicals, you might be able to dig through and figure out, well, you're really low in dopamine because of this, but you just keep throwing, social outings at it. And oxytocin probably isn't going to meet that need for you, at least not enough. Now, one thing I will say about all this, no one neurotransmitter is working at any given time. So while there are 4, and I make it basic because if you know these 4 and know when they're depleted and what you would need to do to lift them up, you know enough. But I can tell you that if we go out and go for a run, we're releasing endorphins, but there's a beginning, middle, and end, and we're feeling good about our exercise regimen. So there's some dopamine there too, and likely some serotonin. Doesn't matter that these all get released at the same time. What matters to me is that you kind of know where basically their lines are and how to use that to your own advantage. This is your manual, people. This right here is the manual to figure out how you tick. So if you're not feeling well, if you're feeling meh, if you're feeling down, if you're feeling stressed, anxious, any of these things, then one of these areas is likely depleted, if not more than one. And if you start to strategically put in place the self-care that lifts that area right back up, woo, you are in for a treat, because you'll start to figure out that you're so much more efficient and effective at lifting your spirits again. All right. So dopamine looks like this when it's depleted. When you don't have enough, you probably feel a lack of motivation. That's the first one. Just inertia. Don't want to do very much. Maybe even a procrastinator, low energy, maybe feeling fatigue, but really it's just kind of more about that. Like, I just don't want to do anything. I really don't have the oomph to get even up off my couch to do very much today. It also can look like a lack of focus. There might be some little bit of anxiousness there. I think sometimes those are showing up because, after you have had inertia for so long and you're not getting to your things, then you start to kind of go, oh God, this is probably not good. I haven't done the laundry in 2 weeks. I haven't gotten to that, report that was due at work. Oh my goodness. So that I think is kind of the layering of how, when dopamine is down, how it starts to show up in our life. You can, at really low levels, start to see mood swings, like, down in the dumps, mostly mood swings. You're not going to see a lot of, oh, I'm high on life and love it, but just, that real swing down. And the thing about that is, and I think I said this last week, but I'll say it again, depression sometimes shows up like irritability, and people don't realize that. But a mood swing also can look like you're flying off the handle pretty easy. And what it's actually meaning is that you're low on this dopamine. You haven't had the motivation to do very much. You're seeing all these other things that suggest this is a dopaminergic issue. And then your mood is kind of like swinging from one side to the other. You're down 1 minute, you're yelling at your spouse the next. So another big piece, though, to dopamine that shows up in our social realm is a sense of low self-worth or self-confidence, right? Think about this, because if what would give us the dopamine is creation, is coming up, with our creative juices, coming up with some sort of version of a beginning, middle, end thing that we want to be involved in, that we feel like hooked in the chase on, it makes sense that one of the ways socially that this is going to show up is you're timid, you're insecure, you have low self-confidence. If that's where you feel like you're at in some different ways, I'd be highly curious if you start to implement more dopamine rich self-care activities, if you start to feel a difference in that. It won't go away overnight, of course. I mean, some of that learned behavior and thinking is just going to linger because it's a habit. But if you start to change the neurochemical basis of it, I would be curious if it starts to lighten your load and you start doing some things that are creative and have a beginning, middle, and end, and then start to build back confidence, right? Okay. So that's dopamine. Serotonin looks like sensitivity in our feelings. So it also can look like that irritability, and it can look like those mood swings. But when we're low here, we're feeling sometimes socially anxious more than just generally anxious. We're kind of anxious about what others are thinking, anxious about, are we doing what we need to be doing? Is this the right thing? Now, go back to what I had told you earlier about what serotonin is. Serotonin gets released when we feel like we're in alignment with our purpose, with what we want to be doing in the world, with what we believe is what we should be doing in the world. So if you're low here, then you're low here because you're not feeling like you're in alignment. And then the anxiety is related to, oh my God, somebody's going to figure out I'm a big fat fraud and I don't know what to do with this. So there's irritability and panic feelings and things like that go along with this, but it's really related to the fact that you're not feeling in that alignment. You might worry a lot. You might feel hopeless about your situation. You may have some low self-confidence in this one as well. There's a little bit of overlap there, but I want you to kind of think about it from the angle of what's behind all that. What's behind all that is you're not feeling in alignment with what you were brought to this world to do. So that's low serotonin. Low oxytocin, pretty easy. It's loneliness. It's feeling alone. And you can feel lonely and alone in a sea of people, right? You might go to work every day and see a lot of folks. You might have family that you're living with or a roommate, but you feel like you don't have any connection. That's when we're starting to lack oxytocin. And oxytocin connection is the only antidote to disconnection. And so it's hard when you're in this place, because if you don't feel like you have the motivation to want to do this. Like, think about this. If you're low in serotonin too, with your oxytocin, you're socially anxious. You're not likely to put yourself out there and try to make connections. And you might be low in both of these areas, right? So one of the things to be thinking about in your self-care regimen is, how do I create connection or feel connected when I don't want to put myself out there too risky. Now, some of the easier ways are things like animals. Having a pet is a huge oxytocin boost. We do have a relationship with these little people, these little animals in our lives. Even if it's a fish in a fish tank, it does not really matter. I mean, snakes are not my thing. I'll just go on record. Things that move without legs freak me out unless they live in water. So I would not be able to snuggle up with my snake, but I do know some people that do. It doesn't matter what this creature is, as long as you feel like you have a connection to it. So there's some places where you might enter this just a little bit easier. Volunteer somewhere, volunteer at the Animal Humane Society if you don't like to work with people, if that's still too much. But you could also just volunteer, drop enough groceries to families that have signed up at the food shelf. Being with others and in connection with others is going to start to build up some of your oxytocin. The more oxytocin you build up, the more brave you might get, and the more you might venture into actually making some of those real solid connections that are essential to human beings. Again, you guys, there's only 2 reasons that our body goes into fight or flight. If our physical body is threatened, like we're going to die, or if our social and interpersonal body is threatened. That is kind of in the background all the time in this world. Do I fit in? Am I good enough? Do people like me? And that fight or flight response, if it keeps chronically going off, is going to start to deplete all of these areas, to be quite frank, because it's going to introduce new chemicals that kind of dampen any of these chemicals, even if you're doing them well and giving yourself the self-care. So just food for thought, right? Like, this is some of the stuff that's happening in our bodies when we're in these circumstances. And then last, certainly not least, we know endorphins. This is, I just said to you not too long ago, this is the one that's really easy to use and it lasts a little bit. So you probably want to have it handy. You do. But this is the one that I think when I do like my assessments, my one-on-ones with women, where we kind of look at all the different areas of your life. And I give you a free 30-minute one-on-one coaching session on, hey, here's the things that I think that you should be doing to kind of circumvent midlife crisis and really get back on course with being in alignment with what you want to be and do in the world. I'm usually looking at if you've been overdoing any one of these categories. Because if you overdo endorphins, you think you're great in your self-care is what happens. There's just kind of this false sense of security that, well, I exercise every day and I take care of my body. And all of those things should be, why I feel better. But I go to work and I feel anxious and I don't want to put my, nose out there. I don't want to try things. I don't want to risk things, but I also feel lonely. There's all, it's what? I don't get it. I'm doing my self-care, Dr. Natalie. Why? This is likely why. You can't just do one of the 4. It's not going to fulfill the other areas that you have a deficit in. It certainly will help, but it will not help in the areas where you have other deficits. So you do need to actually build up in the category where you're feeling depleted. If you're feeling lack of self-confidence, that could be dopamine, that could be serotonin. If you're feeling socially anxious, that could be oxytocin or serotonin. And if you, run 3 times a day, that will not make that go away for you, right? All right. So endorphins, when they're low, it also looks like low mood, but it's mostly like exhaustion, just not doing very much, sleeping a lot more. You don't take the same pleasure in things. And that one is like a slippery slope. When you start to feel like the things that usually bring you joy aren't, or at least not as much as they used to, then you're heading into some territory of clinical depression. And I would suggest that you talk to somebody about that. But those are the kinds of things. It's kind of body-based. It's more the sleep problems and the aches and the physical exhaustion, and your pain tolerance might actually go down. So you start to feel pain more intensely than you normally do when your endorphins are low. Because remember, endorphins are our body's anti-pain medication internally. And so, if you go running 3 times a day, which I don't advise anybody do any of that 3 times a day, once a day, okay. But we don't all have to be these, ultra marathon runners. I think, what you'll start to notice is even if you're doing those kinds of self-care activities, you're feeling more achy and you're feeling more pain after the fact because your pain tolerance is down, because your endorphins are down. And this is also why, when doctors tell you in physical therapy, you need to get out, you need to start moving, you need to get out and start moving because the endorphins actually facilitate that muscle strengthening and give you the anti-pain that you need. Okay. So that's how it looks when they're depleted. And I'm going to go to this next slide and we're going to talk here about how you get your groove back. Okay. And I've been kind of peppering all the way through today's podcast, but let me just kind of hone in on some of the things that really, really work in each of these categories. In dopamine, you could meditate. You could meditate. I know I told you creative things. Of course, there's creative things, but also what we know to be true is that when we meditate, we are releasing dopamine. This is why people like meditation once they actually kind of get a hang of it and do it on the regular. Then they miss it when they don't do it because they have the dopamine hit from having that meditation session. So you want to set, though, some goals for yourself that have beginning, middles, and end that give you a chase, creative things that you can do. There's also, food rich in L-tyrosine could be helpful. Sometimes exercise is also helpful. Remember, again, it's not as clean as each category has its own thing. So dopamine does get released when we're exercising as well. Music, art, all the things. Okay. So that's dopamine. Oxytocin, we want physical touch. Okay. We don't want to talk about, I want to have connection. We actually want to hug somebody. We want to cuddle with somebody. Yet, not all of us have access to this. So physical touch of any kind will release some of this oxytocin and some dopamine and endorphins. So, good on you. So you could get some acupuncture, some massage, something of that nature that's body-based. And get some of that oxytocin. But really what you need to do is get some more connection. So if you want to come in on the entry level, things like pets, playing with kids, honestly, playing games with anybody. So if you're an online gamer, this could be helpful. It's not going to be enough, right? But it is an entry level that might kind of give you a fix for a little while. And the end game being that you do need to have some more deep connections in your life. Because ultimately, when you're low on oxytocin, you need deep connections. That's what you're lacking. Serotonin gets released in our gut. Like I said, 80% of it is released there. So good eating, balanced diet is important. Making sure that your gut biome is working and operating as it should ideally is important. You could talk to a dietitian. You also could probably figure that out just by listening to your body in some ways and not eating the things that make you lethargic, tired, and just funky, just not yourself, but eating the things that really keep your energy level at its premium. Also, going outside, having a little vitamin D, getting some UV rays on your face also can release serotonin and build that up in your body. And low intensity exercise can be helpful. Shocking your system with a bit of a cold shower can be helpful. I know this sounds so weird. There's just some of those, also body-based ones that can release some of the serotonin. Massage, as I said, is kind of going to release a few things at the same time, and serotonin can be one of those things as well. But I would focus, if you feel like you're low in this area, first on diet, getting it balanced, because 80% of those neurons in your belly and 80% of the serotonin being developed in your belly. I know that we think that it's just all this 3-pound organ in our skull that controls all this. That's not the case. So I would do that, and I would go outside. I'd go be in nature, and you'll be picking up that serotonin pretty easily that way. And endorphins. Now, one of my favorite, you didn't realize, but this is the thing that's happening to you when you're laughing and having fun and playing and laughing. And one of the reasons I love humor so much is that's an endorphin release. But so is having a good cry, right? So is releasing any of that kind of bottled up emotion of any kind. So some of us, do that through our humor. We use humor to kind of just offset some of the intensity of emotion for us. But having a good cry is good too. And you don't have to cry about your stuff to get this. So you also could just go watch one of those sappy movies that you know is always going to be a tearjerker for you, and that will release endorphins. And then all the other body-based things that we talked about. So exercise, movement, progressive muscle relaxation, which is squeezing and releasing your muscles. Meditation also will give you a little bit of endorphin hits, but that's not the first thing that I would go to for an endorphin raise. And then spicy food and dark chocolate. And I think citrus, but I can't remember if citrus is actually serotonin or endorphins, but it's one of the two. I didn't put it on my slide and I can't remember, so I'm just going to throw that at you in the podcast. Okay, everyone. So that was a lot of material. That's why I'm going to create this cheat sheet, and you can find it on learntoloveyourstory.com. So if you want to download the cheat sheet itself of all the things I just said, you can download it and watch it or listen to this again, watch it on YouTube or listen to this again, and you might get a little bit more information as you're looking at the actual handout that I have. But I'll have a little cheat sheet for you. There is an actual manual to how this works, how this self-care thing works. So if you can get this formula right, if you start to listen to your body and you know where your deficits are and you know the things you need to do to get it raised, and you keep watching your body mind and you keep figuring out, am I depleted anywhere else? Did something else show up? If you stay on top of this, you will actually optimize your self-care. And that is gold, right? We don't have enough time in the world to do all the things that we would want to do. There just isn't. It is a finite resource time. There's only 24 of those hours every day. So if you want to get the most bang for your buck, then this is a really great way to start in creating a good self-care plan for you. And we're doing all this, ladies and gentlemen, to help you learn to love your story. Because I am a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Minnesota, I have to make sure at the end of each of these episodes that I give you the disclaimer that none of the material that I talk about in these podcasts is meant to replace any kind of therapy or formal medical or mental health treatment. And in fact, anything that I offer on my website, my coaching programs, any kind of psychoeducational materials that I release are not a replacement for that level of care. So just take that into account when you listen. This is information for you, and hopefully you find it of value, both as an educational tool and for your entertainment. And I also want to mention that if anyone you know is in a mental health crisis, needs additional help, I always include these 2 crisis resources. They're available to anybody. Pick up the phone and dial 988 for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And you can always visit their website at suicidepreventionlifeline.org. Additionally, there's actually a crisis text line. So if you're not somebody that likes to pick up the phone, text HOME, home, to 741-741 to the crisis text line. And you can find them online at crisistextline.org. Thank you for listening to my podcast, and I hope that you like and follow me wherever you get your podcasts, and maybe consider leaving me a review. It always helps me to keep this podcast relevant when I know what you want to hear about.